Hello there, it's Paul here and welcome along everyone. Before Christmas, when I was buying all my little kits for things like the calendar, thermometer and stuff like that, I also purchased this clock. I believe it might be a Craft Pro Kits clock, I'm not sure. I got it from Axminster Tools. I can't remember the price. I suspect it was at least 15 if not £25. So it's not what you call a cheap clock, and it is a nice reasonable size. And I absolutely love clocks, and the reason I especially like this one, even though it's a quartz clock, as in it runs on a battery, it's a skeleton clock, so you can see all the movements inside, which is what I really like. Now, I've hummed and hawed what to do with this. Even back in December, 6 months ago, I wanted to make something with this almost straight away. But I took my time. I've done 1 or 2 clock projects over that time. And there was the segmented clock on the little stand, which to be honest wasn't very good, but it's given me an idea of what I want to do. I've done a little bit of searching on the internet for images for ideas, and the main one I'm coming up with at the moment is that I would like some form of a mantel clock. So if we imagine there's our base, the main clocks I've seen as where you've got, say, like 2 round pillars laid flat that way, and then the main clock sits on those 2 pillars, and that's where I want to go with this. It's got to be some form of a mantel clock that sits that way, rather than something that's on a straightforward single pillar with a large base. Now, the important thing to me on this is that I don't want to do it so that you start off with a large piece of wood like this, just hollow out the inside for this to sit inside like that. Now, if you follow my channel, you'll realise that I try an awful lot of things, straight from solid wood to glue up, segmented work, open segmented work, and therefore again I want to try something different. I want to go down the segmented route again, and this is the wood that I've got left over from when I did the 50th birthday present for my wife of the open segmented lighthouse. So I have a reasonable amount of beech here, and I still have some Paduuk left. Now, the good thing about this is that it has like this rubber band on here with these teeth on, so it should go in nice and tightly. Now, my main problem here is that I need to do a 91mm opening on here. Now, the jaws I've got, standard C jaws, really only want to go up to about 90mm maximum to hold inside, and the jaws are really stretched out, so you don't get a great hold. The next size up jaws I've got, the opening's got to be 100mm, and therefore it's going to be too big for this. Now, a while ago I did buy these wood jaw plates from Axminster for my jaws as well. I will probably make up some form of a wood template on there that I can then use them as some form of a soft jaws, so that once I get the segmented ring made up, I can then grip it from inside securely and safely, and it doesn't actually mark all the inside. Now, a lot of the work I'm doing here is going to be stuff that you've seen me do all the time before. I'm going to do this as a time-lapse video. I've just got a basic idea here of what I want to do for this project in the way of shape. So to start off with, I'm going to be making 2 segmented rings. After cutting some strips off at the required thicknesses, I then cut all the segments to the required length. As you'll see there on the table saw, that you do get all these little fuzzy edges on the edge of the pieces. This means that they all have to be sanded, and it doesn't actually take too long by hand. And as I sand each of them up, I mark them all depending on which side of the wedgie sled I used as to how they've all got to be glued together. I just use the normal method of gluing all the pieces together, and that's by smearing a small amount of glue on each piece and then hold it together for about 15 to 20 seconds. I start off by gluing everything into 2s, and then I glue some of them into 4s, and then so I can end up with 6s, which gives me 2 halves. I'll leave these for about 30 minutes. Once I've done that, I can then sand the ends flat, just to make sure that I've got 2 perfect halves, which can be glued together to give me the perfect ring. Now, there's always going to be some small amount of inaccuracy when you cut the pieces. Even on these rings, which are only 12 segments per ring, that's actually 24 edges that have got to be cut, and it'll end up being out 2.4 degrees on the final ring. I'm using the wood plate jaws, which I've just made some basic plates here to hold the rings on. Just using a sanding board, I want to get all the sides flat. 2 rings are glued together, left another 20-30 minutes before I can then put these back onto the lathe. Once I've got it onto the lathe, I can then just true up part of the outside and create a very shallow tenon so that I can put these into my larger jaws. You can see that the jaws are being fairly well stretched to their limits. So after I've trued up the outside, I can then work on the inside, fit the clock movement. Now the good thing about using these large jaws with a shallow tenon on it is that it means that I've got a lot of clearance behind the rings. That means that I can then use tools like the skew chisel to actually go right the way through both rings without any fear of catching the jaws at the back. It is a case of slowly taking small amounts of material away as you go. With the movement now fitting into the rings properly, I can now make 3 more rings to all be glued up together. And this will now consist of 2 more beech rings and another Paduuk, and I'll follow the same process I did with the first 2 rings, making sure they're flat on both sides. Now I've also made some new plates for the wood jaws to remount the rings on. These should actually hold it a lot better. Once I've actually glued all the 5 segments together, I can then flip it from front to back, true up the inside and the outside, taking them both down to the required sizes. Once all the turning has been completed on the main body, I'll then sand through all the grits, starting at about 120 grit, right the way up to 600 grit. So I've now produced this main ring, which is what the clock face is going to sit in. I've got a more curved piece on this end, which is where the face is going to be housed on, and it's just more of a sharper finish on the back. I've just took the edge off slightly. I've ordered some extra parts that I want to go into the other 2 segmented rings, which is going to be a thermometer and a hydrometer, or hydrometer, however you pronounce it. Basically tells you the humidity in the air, and because I need to really wait for those before I can start making the rings on those, because I want to make sure that I make them the right size, all I can really do is try and do a finish on this. If you just watched hopefully what was my last video where I went through on how to make some shellac, I did do a test piece there which is not fully finished off yet, and that I'm really pleased with, so that's why I'm going to do a shellac finish on this, and hopefully I'll do it so that I don't get too much of a build up on the edges, so that I can then just apply a light coat on the inside. This process is going to take quite some time. Shellac really is worthwhile doing if you've got the time and patience for it. Applying shellac to a ring like this is a little bit awkward, but luckily it's actually a reasonable size that I can fit my hand in the ring and grab hold of the ring properly. I've also used boiled linseed oil here as a lubricant, which is really only applied in really small amounts. Now I've given this quite a few coats of shellac on the outside. Inside has only had 1 or 2 coats. I left that to dry or fully harden overnight, and then I used the micro mesh, where I started off sanding at about 3,000 grit and went right the way up to 12,000, and it's had, hopefully you can see there on the camera where the reflection is on there. It's absolutely lovely. But during the week I've had my other 2 parts delivered, which is those 2. I might actually make them so that they're stepped in, so that they're, rather than the 5 rings like this, that they're just 3, so, and alternate them as well, so that I then have the Paduuk in the centre with the beech on the outsides. For the two small cylinders, these consist of 3 rings. They're also made up of 12 segments, exactly the same as the main body is. As they're a lot smaller, I can actually hold these in the standard C jaws to sand them flat on both sides, where I can make sure that they're all the same thickness before gluing them all together. I've then switched over to my O'Donnell jaws, as this moves all the work further away from the chuck, and I've created a tenon on both ends. The outside is then trued up before the inside is then hollowed out to fit the extra gauges. After the inside has been sanded, the outside is then taken down to the required size and then sanded up through the grits again. To remove the remaining part of the outside of the cylinder, I've mounted this on a jam chuck and slowly working towards the chuck, taking light cuts, and I will just sand up through the grits as I did before. The two cylinders are then finished off with shellac in exactly the same way as the main body was. Work on these is certainly a lot harder than the main body, as I can only actually fit 2 fingers inside to hold them. Whilst the shellac is drying, I start off the base by gluing up a length of beech and Paduuk. The small cylinders are then wet sanded up to the 12,000 grit using the micro mesh like I did with the main body. Going back to the base, I actually just cut then the 2 lengths that I glued up together into equal lengths so that they're longer than what I want the base. I also then cut a length of beech. Then they can all be glued together to make up the whole base. When the base is finally dry, I then just sand this up on my bench sander to get it as flat as possible. I then cut it to length on the table saw. And then finally sand it up through the grits right the way up to 600. To make it easier to apply the shellac to the base, I've glued a block of wood underneath so it gives me something to hold on to. Then I've got free access to all 4 sides and the top. To join everything together, I've decided the best way is to use dowels, so I turned in a piece of beech using the skew. So that I can line up the holes of where to put all the dowels in, I cut the ends of some large nails off that I sharpened to a point. These can then be placed in the holes on one piece of the work, and then when I push the 2 pieces together, we'll then mark where I need to drill the holes on the other piece. Now I don't have much clearance on my pillar drill, so drilling the large ring, I then have to do this by hand. Once all the holes have been drilled in the cylinders, the dowels can then be cut and fitted on a dry run. This will allow me to drill and mark for where the other two cylinders are to be attached to the base. When everything is made, a final buff of all the pieces is done. For the final assembly, the dowels are all glued in before the components are installed. French polishing, shellac for all of these rings went on really well, and they came up a really nice shine. Now I did sand them all the way up to 12,000 grit, and they came up a really nice finish, which is what I was after. The thing I found was that when I did the base, I thought that was going to be a lot easier because you're working in one big open area, one flat spot, and I just couldn't get any shine on it whatsoever. I was polishing this over a course of probably 3 or 4 days and just couldn't improve it whatsoever, which is why in the end that I decided to put the whole lot on the buffing wheel. The main segment of rings just had a really light buff, really with what polish was just left on the wheel itself, whereas the base I then put fresh polish on so that it buffed the whole thing up. Thanks a lot for watching, and I'll see you in the next project video.